Welcome to Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. Coming up on the programme this week.
It's just so sad when you look years later where those people could be and what kind of lives they could have, and for their families that they're not here anymore. It's just such a wasted death. One suicide actually creates tens of people around that suicide that are susceptible to suicide because of the trauma, because of the shame, because of the guilt, and the people that find it really, really very difficult to move on from. It's so tragic because you just think, if they were here now, where would they be? And what would they be doing? And how differently could this look? It just doesn't need to be like this.
The home of the UK's conversation about mental health. Welcome to Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle, and it's brilliant to have you with us once again on World Suicide Prevention Day 2025. And a fantastic guest who is really going above and beyond, using her profile for fantastic work, particularly focused around young suicide. Our guest on the podcast this week is Lou Teasdale. Now, Lou, shot to fame as the stylist, hairdresser, now beauty influencer, working with bands like One Direction, now in her own right does some great work and is well known throughout the world and has more than 5 million followers on Instagram. But she's using that platform to talk about a really important subject, and she's using that platform as well to inform the work that she's doing with Body and Soul, which is a charity which does fantastic work in the anti-suicide space, not just for those who are experiencing suicidal thoughts, but for people around them as well. And actually having a path, having a stepway that young people can be part of, that people in general can be part of, to help them step away from suicidal crisis, to take them away from a point at which they don't want to be here anymore to a point where actually they see value in themselves and the people around them, and they see their place within community, stepping away from those really difficult thoughts which do come to many young people, as we'll hear in the conversation with Lou. And we'll talk about the stats. 7% of young people thinking about suicide by the age of 17, 1,840 young lives lost to suicide in the latest figures from 2023. The leading cause of death in young people, it's suicide. We've got to do something about it, and Lou Teasdale is using her platform to make that happen.
I mean, the figure at the minute in young people is we have around 1,000 people a week attempting suicide in this country, which is a number that is increasing, and it's just really very shocking. And something, that I always find is there is so much offered to illnesses, physical illnesses, when you go to our health services in this country with any sort of physical illness, whether it be something needs stitching up, whether something needs surgery, or maybe it be something that might be terminal illness, and something that, could be thought as fatal, would be offered hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of care. Whereas to me, the only fatalities that I've known in the past 10 years have been through suicide. And that's something which, when we go to our health services, there's very, very little offered. And it just leaves all of these young people very vulnerable.
Yeah, and there's obviously a real tragedy in losing a young person at such an age, and in a set of circumstances which I think often throw up so many questions, don't they, and leave a real legacy of grief beyond, a physical illness maybe.
We always say at Body and Soul that suicide is contagious, and one suicide actually creates tens of people around that suicide that are susceptible to suicide because of the trauma, because of the shame, because of the guilt, and the people that find it really, really very difficult to move on from that person's life. And there aren't really any other illnesses that like that. I think normally when somebody dies from a tragic accident or an illness, people really scoop each other up and look after each other. It's very rare that it causes conflict or feelings of shame in families and divide. And actually suicide is just, it's so toxic and affects so many people, even not just those who are actually successfully attempt, but everybody around them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess as well, it leads so many unanswered questions for so many people as well. But also, questions around that young person's, the fact that that young person went to the thought of suicide, you know, the difficulties they must have been having to have been contemplating suicide, where, we try and put our arms around young people, don't we? We try and offer support, but for them to be in such a lonely place, it's really difficult, isn't it, for us to sort of get our heads around that. We think optimistically, don't we, about young people, and we think about either our kids or our grandkids or whoever it would be, and we think about them sort of seizing the world and looking for all those opportunities. And for that door to be slammed shut in such a way, is a tragedy on so many levels.
Yeah, and I mean, it doesn't really miss anybody out. So obviously, at Body and Soul, I actually work on one of the programs. So I'm actually training in DBT counselling. So we offer a 6 month program that's actually really very successful, and it combines DBT counselling, which is basically life skills, with community and lifelong support rather than just short-term intervention, which is what the other services offer. And you can see the sort of cross section of people on there from all different backgrounds. Some people that really don't have anyone that's putting their arms around them, and making sure they're okay, and that's the issue. People from really severe abuse and people from marginalized backgrounds, um, but then also all of my examples in my life and my experiences of people who have actually been successful at committing suicide or attempted, they're from very privileged backgrounds who do have families just doing absolutely everything that they can. But I think what happens with suicide and what happens with a lot of mental health is it gets left on friends, family, and employers maybe, who end up getting blamed, when actually, if they had a cut on their finger, you wouldn't expect those people to stitch that up. That would be ludicrous. Whereas with mental health, that's who it gets left on. And actually, where I've been in that position, I'm sort of screaming out, I'm just not qualified to do this. The same as, with some of our staff in the salon or something like that, they're coming to us with their mental health, putting it on us as the employer. And a lot of employers I find are feeling the same. Then they're not qualified to actually help that person, and neither are our school teachers, or people's mums who it gets left on. And there's just such a huge gap, and it pretty much misses everybody.
I think there's that idea, isn't there, that if it was flagged as a potential issue, that there's almost like and we have mental first aider, and I'm trained in mental first aid myself. But like, again, if we draw the link to the comparison, the first aider would look at you, speak to you, deal with you, stop the bleeding in your finger or whatever it would be. But then if that bleeding continued,
It would
or
be escalated.
you'd escalate it up, isn't it? And that's a real. Do you think that's the thing that's missing, that we have within society? That escalation, that pathway, that clear pathway. You fall over, you break your leg, you go to A&E, you end up in hospital for a few days, you get a big plaster on your leg, you're on crutches for 6 weeks, then you don't do any exercise for 3 months, and then you get back on your feet. That's a real clear pathway that I've just sprung off the top of my head related to
Yeah.
the broken leg. But actually, I don't think anyone knows that pathway. I don't think anyone knows, in the main, what number they should call if they're feeling suicidal. Or if
Yeah.
they think someone's about to die by suicide, do they know that you call 999 and report it as, an emergency? I don't think people know those first steps, which I think leads on to the situation that we've got ourselves in society, whereby someone now mentions suicide, and people go, "Oh, don't ask me," or like they back away from it, or they think, "Oh, I'll leave that alone," because it ends up being wrapped in and shrouded, doesn't it, in shame and stigma, as opposed to it being, "Oh, suicide, you need to do this, 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 and this," and that would be such a big step, wouldn't it?
And as well, what we find, at our charity is a lot of services that are out there. Once someone has actually attempted, they are deemed too high risk to actually take on, and then have to be referred back to regulated professional services, which it doesn't have that structure that it needs or the funding. Um, and I think that they're sort of trying, but all of my experiences with people that I've known who have been successful have been through a number of um, emergency A&E nights where there's been an attempt, and the follow up from that is pretty much nothing. And so that's kind of why I was so inspired by what Body and Soul are doing, because I'd got involved or tried to get involved with a couple of different bigger branded sort of helpline style suicide prevention charities. But even as a volunteer, when you speak on those helplines, you actually in the training, you can't say anything. You can only listen. You can't really offer any support. And these are huge charities that do a lot of work for awareness, but they raise millions of pounds a month and actually aren't doing anything on the ground for people who are attempting. Whereas at Body and Soul, they have a program that's been running for 30 years that they've put almost 1,000 people through, and they take people who are already attempting, and they've never had one reattempt of anybody that's been through that program. It really works, and they've really nailed something that I found uh, that I couldn't find when I needed that. The program is for the person attempting, but they also have another program which is for the people supporting those who are attempting. So I would get to a point when I was trying to support people going through this where I needed support to support, because it's so intense and I don't understand. Like I say, I'm not qualified to look after that person. And as well, if you've got somebody in an abusive relationship or has abusive parents, or somebody who is neurodivergent, or somebody who is slightly narcissistic in your family, it's no good putting them through the program and them understanding these skills to regulate their emotions, but the person in the house who is affecting them not understanding that as well. And so that's another thing that Body and Soul do, which is what is really, I think, really cool, is they offer the support there as well. And then with the community aspect with the charity, so the lifelong support, basically, once you've been through the program, which is why it needs funding, you end up with a person who can just start to feel a little bit like life's worth living again, and make some life goals, even if they're small, and come out of it the other end feeling just enough support. It's not a magic wand, and it doesn't happen overnight. And I've seen some of the group members feel a bit like, well, I thought it would be more than this, but actually it's always very emotional at the end, and it's a completely different mindset, which is really the only way to do it.
Is that, do you think, does that speak to the idea of actually, rather than having sort of reactive services, that actually you put measures in place which are much more proactive, that help to build somebody up and build them away from thoughts of suicide, as opposed to those maybe services which are linked to those people who are, who are at the brink, if you like. And actually, the charity's called Body and Soul, and there's something in that, isn't it, about winning over hearts and minds. And people think I sometimes sound a bit soppy but when people talk about like love and caring about someone, showing someone that they have a real sort of, that people love them, care for them, that they can love themselves, and that even if they're not there now, they can be in that place. That speaks, doesn't it, to much more building somebody back up to greater resilience, greater self-awareness, self-love, an understanding of their place within society as well. And I guess you can't do that over a phone call, but those sort of courses that you're talking about there, much more intensive, and I guess require a really strong buy-in that people
Yeah.
have got to feel like they're valuable enough to take part in it, and of course they are valuable enough to take part in it, but they might not necessarily feel like that at the start of a project like that.
Yeah, and it's really key. And they always say it when we're sort of going through um some of the taglines of the charity, but they'll say we're killing suicide with love. And yeah, it does sound a bit soppy like that, but it's a really important element that Emma, who founded the charity, I think she instills this, and I think that she just finds people to work for her that do that really naturally. And when you go in there, you can feel it. And that's what I found really inspiring, because a lot of suicide prevention services that are offered elsewhere are done in isolation. Um, like you said, they're crisis prevention and short term, whereas this is done in a community, and in a group. Nobody's really doing any one-on-one trauma therapy or anything that intense. They're doing group DBT therapy, which is basically learning skills that we all need, really, which is learning how to you know distress tolerance and regulate our emotions, and interpersonal effectiveness. So just dealing with, how you would deal with somebody in your family where the relationship's important compared with how you deal with your boundaries at work, where you can stand your ground a little bit more. And just really simple things like that, which, help people get through life being validated by people around them because they're handling themselves in a different way. And when people are suffering with really severe depression and anxiety, they almost, you know, throw themselves in those situations completely wrong and don't get any validation for how they're feeling because they're not regulating themselves, and it's just a spiral. And so they just teach things like that, which, sound really simple, but actually a lot of people don't get those skills. It's things I think need to be taught in schools and at work, first and foremost, for us to be able to, when we do have a good relationship, thrive in that relationship, rather than destroy it, you know?
Absolutely. We'll get links to the Body and Soul Charity Instagram or the new website as well, and the Let's Kill Suicide campaign, which is up and running for World Suicide Prevention Day 2025. We'll get that up on the notes to the podcast
Thank
so
you.
people can click on those links. Can I ask you, in terms of like young people who end up in those situations where they've, 7% of young people by the age of 17 have thought about or attempted suicide, a really shocking figure. Leading cause of death in young people as well. 300 young people a day at least attempting suicide. The numbers are, really, really shocking and will be surprising to a lot of people as well. What sort of feedback does the charity get about what young people are thinking? What are those sort of like themes that come back to the charity when they're going, okay, how did you find yourself in this situation? Is it about, are there particular things that we can work on? Is it something that we as a society are putting on young people? Is there a misunderstanding about maybe how they view themselves in society? What sort of things do we hear about why the situation's so bad and those numbers are so bad?
So I mean, a huge sort of, symptom of what starts us off is trauma in people's lives, and that can come from, people from their families. One of the huge ones that someone told me really early on, when you're looking at things that affect people, so obviously an abusive parent that sets somebody off from such a young age, and that is going to really struggle to deal with anything thrown at them in life. Whereas you can have someone with a really great support network at home, but actually people who are bullied at school bullying can create, really, really severe trauma, that when people then go into the workplace or go into relationships in their adult life, they really, really cannot cope with any sort of conflict, and they can't regulate their emotions. And school bullying is one of the worst cases of it. When actually I was lucky enough to not have to deal with anything like that. But it probably, before I heard that and before I saw the people involved in the charity who suffer so badly from it, it probably wouldn't be something I would think of to take that seriously, you know? And so things like that, I think as a society, we need to understand how, bullying and things like online bullying, and these things come from above. These things come from seeing the press bullying people, and people thinking, you know, on their podcast or whatever, you know, getting something viral because it's laughing at somebody. That's a human being that then has to, face the world. And as a society, I think we all just do need to be a little bit kinder, because there's generally somebody struggling at the root of that. And so, yeah, things like body image conversations. I know it's a big conversation now, but um, we have a lot of people on our group who are restricting food, whether it be for self-harm or whether it be because of body image issues, and which as a society, I think we're all responsible for making sure, and as parents, we're responsible for making sure that we're being kind about these things. Um, uh, People from diverse backgrounds, people from minority, LGBTQ community. We have a lot of trans kids on there. There's such a hostile attitude towards trans people, and people just, spout out this rhetoric, and it is just, when you're actually dealing with these human beings who um just want to be accepted for who they are, and they're not hurting anybody, they're not harming women in women's toilets. That's just not the reality. It's really hard, and it's really eye-opening to be there actually, you know dealing with these people, and they're attempting suicide because they don't see any way of living a life worth living.
Yeah, and I think, and I've had this. I had a chat with Jake Quickenden, who you know Jake, I'm sure from
Yeah.
various different things, and he was saying over he'd put something on Instagram or something. He's a guy who's had like a high profile career, but people say to him, "Why are you still trying to stay relevant? Like why you like just this idea that being yourself
Yeah.
was like
Is a
not
negative.
yeah is like it's not like it's not enough just to exist and to sort of live your life and be yourself. You've got to somehow have all these things that are going on and exciting and interesting and be like almost like a little puppet for other people to sort of live their life through. And of course I think I'm lucky that I'm a little bit older now and I've got kids myself, but like they could do anything. I'm obviously staying on the right track, but like they don't need to do really well at school. They don't, to be themselves
Yep.
is enough. And I think we've not quite got that in society, have we? That just to be is enough. You are enough just on your own. The smile, waking up in the morning, saying good morning to passing someone in the street, all of that is enough, gives you that stake in society that you need. Beyond anything that you think you're supposed to do as dictated by those other people who probably aren't actually, themselves contributing a lot to
Yep.
society. And that's a huge thing, isn't it? To suddenly go, actually, I'm just enough on my own, and I can, and everything I need is either here or within this small community of people that are around me.
Yeah, and for our kids to actually feel that, they need, a secure base at home, making them feel like that. And unfortunately, everybody doesn't have that. And so it's about making sure that those people who don't have that have access to somewhere that can help them with this sort of spiral. And yeah, that's what, and Body and Soul, that they're such a small charity, but they really have created a roadmap for helping those people. But yeah, for us, like, our sort of call to action is just trying to, get people to donate. We are actually going into Parliament as well to try and put some calls to action there, to put some responsibility over there, to make sure that there is funding going over here, because they don't need to create that. We actually have a system that's working. We would just really like to be able to give a lot more people access to that.
I think that's a brilliant thing, isn't it? That finding that way and finding something that works, and then sharing it. And, people always say people work in silos. That's the phrase I always hear that, essentially people just keep their own sort of pot to themselves. But actually that idea of sharing that information, absolutely. And Lou, I know you mentioned before about, you'd been aware yourself of losing people around you to suicide of a younger. What is it for you that you dwell on or you think about when you think about maybe people that you've lost or those stories that you've heard of those who've been lost that summarize that real tragedy of this sort of well, it's a pandemic of suicide that we're facing with our young people.
Um, I mean, for me and the people that I've lost that I really loved, obviously, like anybody, it's so tragic because you just think, if they were here now, where would they be? And what would they be doing? And how differently could this look? But they just didn't have the support, even though, you know, all of them were very lucky to have a really great support network. Um, and privileged people who earn a lot of money and have big employers that are also trying to help and things like that are still ending up in that same place. And it's so tragic because it just doesn't need to be like this. And a couple of the situations that I was in, we ended up with paramedics coming in and people coming in and sort of saying, can you escalate this? Obviously, paramedics aren't qualified either to deal with the extreme level of attempting that some of them were dealing with, but it just doesn't even get escalated. There's nowhere for it to even go. And I feel like even if some of them wanted to pay for it and spend thousands of pounds on treatment, it's a little bit like, well, what does that actually look like and does that work? And so it's just so sad when you look years later where those people could be and what kind of lives they could have and for their families and things like that they're not here anymore. And it's just such a wasted death.
Yeah, I think it's a really great sort of summary of that as an issue, and it speaks to that wider issue, doesn't it? That we can't bring these people back, but there are people alive today who might be thinking about suicide today, tomorrow, in the next week, in the next month, and it's like, what pathway can we put them on? How can we build them out the other side? And actually, what you've described there from body and soul about it being sort of like that holistic approach to sort of helping rebuild someone's self-esteem, their resilience, putting those measures in place sounds like a fantastic thing. Like you say, a small organization but doing some fantastic work. We'll put all the links to there on the podcast notes. And Lou, thank you so much for being so honest about your journey as well and sharing your story on the podcast today. Thank you for speaking to us, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
I hope you've enjoyed this week's podcast. Thanks for checking out Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. You can find me on Twitter at Mr. Mick Coyle. You can also find me, Mick Coyle, on Facebook as well. Don't forget, if you want to speak to somebody about your mental health, you can do so. The Samaritans, free to call on 116 123. You can find mental health services where you are. Just look for the Hub of Hope. Type in your postcode. It'll find those mental health services close to you. And for support in a crisis, you can text SHOUT to 85258. That's if you're experiencing a personal crisis, you're unable to cope and need support. Shout to 85258. That's a text line. Do get involved in those services. In an absolute emergency, always remember the number to call is 999. Thanks for downloading the podcast this week. We'll be back next week with more Mental Health Monday.